In addition to the Poor People's Campaign, you are also the founder of Repairs of the Breach. And there is, of course, a breach, a divide in this country. Can you talk about that?
So the first thing we have to do in our work in repairs of the breach, we believe the first thing is moral analysis, moral articulation, moral attention, and moral action. Moral analysis means you got to look at the breaches through the eyes of the people that have fallen in those breaches. You got to be clear about what the breaches are. And we believe there are 5 breaches: systemic racism and the breaches that occur in this democracy um, because of systemic racism and because of the mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, because of how indigenous people are treated on reservations even today. They breached this because of unjust immigration policies towards Latinos and other people of color, Haitians, Africans, and even the breach that is caused in white people's lives because of the collateral damage of racism. Then the next breach is systemic poverty. We right now have 43 million people, 440 million people in this country, 43% of this nation before COVID, that were in the breach of poverty and low wealth in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. That's nearly 50% of the people who get up every morning and cannot make it, cannot afford a $500 emergency. Some of them can't afford a $5 emergency. Over 52% of our children. The breach where even today, some 31 million people make less than a $15 living wage. And we haven't raised the minimum wage in over 9 years. That's a breach. And then we have the breach of ecological devastation, where every morning from Flint to the mountains of Appalachia, people can get up and buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. 4 million families right now before COVID. And then we have the breach of denial of healthcare. 87 million people were either uninsured or underinsured before COVID ever hit. And since COVID, we've not closed that breach. It's only widened. We've not felt in our consciousness as a nation, even in the midst of COVID, that we ought to at least provide what every other wealthy country in the world provides, and that's some form of universal health care. The United States is the only of the wealthiest 25 countries in the world that doesn't offer some form of health care for all of its people, even though every politician that goes to Washington, D.C. gets free health care. But they block the people. That's a breach. And then the breach of the war economy. Before Ukraine and Russia's attack, ungodly, unmitigated attack, premeditated attack, excuse me, we spent 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy and less than 16 cents on healthcare and education. That's a breach. Whenever you spend that much money on the war economy, and by the war economy, I don't mean to fight against injustice and totalitarianism and autocracy. I mean money that was just going to the war corporations, the profiteers. One contract for 1 year, for instance, of Lockheed Martin could fund every state that has refused to expand Medicaid. That's the breach we're talking about. And then the last one is the breach, we call it the false narratives of religious nationalism, that says that if you believe in guns, attacking gay people, being against Latino people and immigrants, and stand for tax cuts and the Republican Party, then somehow you are on God's side, when we know that agenda is so far away from the true agenda of justice and love and mercy that's articulated in all of our greatest faiths. So those are what we call 5 interlocking injustices, interlocking evils that continue to be a breach, continue to create breaches in our society. And the first thing you have to do is face it, and you have to say it, and you have to speak against it. But then you have to not only have moral articulation, you got to have moral I mean, moral analysis of what the problem is. You have to have moral articulation to speak out against it. And then you have to not only speak out against it, you have to have moral attention and put a face on the numbers. So it's not just numbers, that the nation is forced to see the breaches in the faces of the people, the stories of the people, the pain of the people, the lives of the people. And then you must have moral action to close the breaches by saying, not only are we cursing the breaches, but we're offering hope.
This is not asking for much.
Yeah, well, right. And you know, the thing about it, you say that, but actually some people looked at our agenda and said, it really is not much. In fact, a group of economists that work with us looked at what we're talking about and said that America cannot stand the strain much longer of nearly 50% of its people living in poverty that has been exposed exponentially during COVID. While during COVID, billionaires increased their wealth by 70%, while 8 million more people fell into poverty. Eventually, that's going to create social struggle that's not going to provide for the what we call in our Constitution, what we say we are to not promote the general welfare, which we are, but we're supposed to ensure domestic tranquility. You cannot ensure peace and domestic tranquility with this level of inequality that is unnecessary and could be fixed with just a few passages of a few bills that also would benefit the society. For instance, if you raise the living wage right now to $15, which we got close to this year, only Manchin and Sinema blocked it. But if it had happened, 41% of African Americans would have immediately been raised out of poverty and low wealth. 31 million Americans, 41% of African Americans, 31 million Americans, and we would have pumped 300 and some odd billion dollars into the economy. We lose $1 trillion a year by allowing 52% of our children to exist in poverty. And the Children Defense Fund has showed us that if you take 2% of the gross domestic product, which is over $21 trillion, if you took 2% of the federal budget, not the gross domestic product, the federal budget, and put it to programs that work, you could end child poverty tomorrow. So what these economists have said is not doing this is constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, politically insensitive, and economically insane. Our movement is saying we got to have three things in the poor. We've got to have a moral reset, and we got to face all these issues simultaneously. You can't have the Black folk over here dealing with racism, the white folk dealing with wages, the environmentalists dealing. These are all interlocking injustices. Number two, we've got to change that moral narrative by changing the narrators. Number three, we've got to offer America a third Reconstruction agenda. We've had two Reconstructions. Both of them were either assassinated, killed, or stopped. We never finished them, but we can finish it now. And we must build power, because now poor and low wealth people make up 33% of the electorate, and in battleground states, 45% of the electorate. And if they come together and organize around an agenda, less than 25% of poor and low wealth people who have not voting. Just 25% of those, not 80%, 60%, 25% of those who are already registered who have not voted, if they vote around an agenda that is for them, they could choose who sits in the presidency, governor's office, and the Senate. So the possibility to change the breach is in our hands.
Yes, yes.
We just got to have the moral consciousness to do it.
Now you know, obviously, Moral Mondays and that the moral, you use the word moral, right? But we see on the national stage, I mean, what just happened with Judge Brown Jackson, that was anything but moral, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, how do you chip away at that? I mean, it's just like race and racism is, ingrained in the fabric of America. Are we going to mend that in our lifetime?
Well, I think every generation has, as Edmund Pettus Bridge has his fight. We have to do our part. And what we know is we've seen what happened before, and we've overcome it before. And so we'll judge Brown, but it can't be just about an individual. See, one of the ways we can't just celebrate Judge Brown and not keep the fight for the full restoration of voting rights. We can't accept, and even Democrats, if they want us to accept one without the other, we have to say no. You can't say, okay, well, we have a justice on the Supreme Court, so now it's okay that we didn't pass the living wage and we didn't pass Build Back Better. No, you have to have a full agenda. And as they used to say in the civil rights movement, what do we want? Freedom. How much do we want? All of it.
All of
And so we have to have an all of it mind. And it's not for the politicians to build a movement to demand all of it. It's for a moral movement to build it, made up of impacted people, religious leaders, and advocates. And that's what we're doing as a Poor People's Campaign, along with the Kairos Center and my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Harris, are leading the development of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. You got to build a campaign, not a day,
that's
not a convention, but a campaign that's willing to be in the streets, in the suites, and at the voting booths. We're planning right now a mass Poor People's Low Wage Workers Assembly, moral march on Washington and to the polls on June 18th, because every fundamental shift in this nation, there was some social meeting, whether it was the abolitionist meeting in the 1850s or the bonus marches in the 1830s or the civil rights marches. And they weren't marches, they were campaigns, like the Birmingham campaign, the Selma campaign. And none of them was singular issue things. Dr. King was in Selma, he said, not just to get voting rights for Black folk, but to change democracy and to fight against the goal of the Southern aristocracy, which was to keep the masses of poor Negro people and poor white people from coming together to form an economic power, a voting bloc that could change the economic architecture. So we need to sometimes study our movements. I think many times today, and some of our civil rights groups are too mono-focused. They're too focused on just one issue. They don't connect the dots. So let's take, for instance, the Justice Brown. Now, yes, not one of those senators would have ever said they were attacking her because of her race, because they're too smart for that. They're not going to call her N-word, and they might talk down to her, but they're not going to do it. So part of the analysis is, why did they, for instance, want the Barrett lady? Well, some people say that they wanted her because of her stance on abortion. But if you look deeper, you find out that 90% of the time she voted for corporations. And so did Kavanaugh, and voted against voting rights, right? So what we saw in Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz, is they were trying to call our dear sister everything but a child of God. But it's not just because she was Black. That's a part of it. It's because if she was a Black conservative or a Black Clarence Thomas, they'd be fine. Lindsey Graham said that. What they're voting against is her consciousness and her Jewish prudence that is shaped by a concern for justice, a concern for the least of these. She would be the kind of judge that will not give corporations more power than people. She'll treat people like people, not corporations like people. She would be a judge that will vote to protect equal protection under law and protect voting rights. That's what she'll protect women's rights. She'll protect public education. So that's why they were saying all those other things and trying to call her all those names. But, it's that she happens to be Black. She happens to be Black. But the larger issue, as Thurgood Marshall once said, when he was asked, when he was leaving the court, should a Black judge replace him? Thurgood Marshall said, not necessarily. He said, I want to see a Black judge replacement, but I don't want Blackness to be used as an excuse to put a judge on the bench whose jurisprudence is against Black people and brown people and white people and justice. Gotcha. So part of what I think to close this breach, we have to dig deeper, and when we have movements, take for instance, the March on Washington. If you go back and read the history of that march, it wasn't a Black march, it was a march for jobs and justice. They had an agenda. They had healthcare, housing, living wage of $2 an hour, which would be $15 today if they had implemented, and voting rights. We make a mistake to suggest the March on Washington was just a Black march where Dr. King gave a speech about a dream. And I think part of what we have to do if we're going to challenge the Grahams and the Cruzes today is really, unpack them, understand what their real goals are. If you have an adversary politically or physically, you have to know that adversary. Ted Cruz doesn't want Justice Brown on the bench, because if things continue to go in the direction they're going, and Biden or another president got to appoint 2 more justices that are focused on equal protection under the law, then Texas can't pass racist voter suppression law to get away with it. If Texas can't pass racist voter suppression laws, Texas is now majority people of color. And so people of color and poor people in Texas can form together, and Texas would no longer be a quote unquote red state.
Voting Rights Act, right? And someone, actually a group in seeking support for Voting Rights Act protections, they said, they sent me a text and they said, GOP is trying to create Jim Crow, or pass Jim Crow 2.0. How important is, protecting the Voting Rights Act? And do you think we take those rights that we do have for granted, or that we take?
I think sometimes we have. I think that we in the civil rights and moral community must also critique ourselves. The Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013 when Obama was president. Now, if we're honest, the movement went to Selma to remember every year since 2013. That's been 8 years. And we didn't really put on the civil rights justice community did not make voting rights a political issue in the 2014 elections or the 2016 election. I mean, we have to own that. The Voting Rights Act was gutted June 25th, 2013. Maybe we should have had maybe Moral Mondays and people in the street in every state in the country then, even when Obama was there, even when Holder was there. We should have demanded then. Every time we went to Selma, we should have left Selma and mobilized. So let's first of all critique ourselves and say that this issue is not new. It's gotten worse. It's not because of the Trump lie. It's because of the decision of the Supreme Court in 2013. And if you go back and check the election in 2014, 2016, voting rights was not among the top 3 issues that were pushed and talked about on the Republican or the Democratic debates for president. And we have to own that. We tried in North Carolina to connect the dots, and we began fighting racist voter suppression bills in 2013. Took us 5 years, 4 years of Moral Monday, 1,200 arrests, and we beat them. And we unseated the governor that signed off on the laws. But it was hard work.
Yeah.
We've got hard work that we have to do in civil rights community. But I'm probably going to get in a little trouble, but I'll say to you, I don't think this is Jim Crow. I think it's James Crow Esquire. Because, and it's an important for our analysis. You see, if the current voter suppression laws stay on the book that have been passed just last year, because Manchin and Sinema blocked restoring the Voting Rights Act and passing the For the People's Act, 55 million Americans, not Black folk, will lose access to the polls that they had in 2020. Think about that now. That means that we've have over 400 bills that are in state houses. And in the bills that have been passed, you have voter suppression bill passed in Texas that looks like voter suppression bill passed in Montana. Montana hardly has any Black folk, and Texas has a majority of people of color. So something is going on other than just race. Race is at the tip of the spear. But what we have going on is an attempt to stop the progressive power in this country. What we have is an attempt through gerrymandering to fix it so that people can win and their party not produce the majority of the votes.
Mm-hmm.
because it's called stacking, packing, and bleaching. So you could have a state where the majority of the people overall vote for Democrats, but Republicans control, say, the congressional delegation because of the way they gerrymander the district.
Yeah, the way it's
That's not just Jim Crow. And I think, and it's not just, we don't need to make voting rights the special interest issue of Black folk. I disagreed with the president and I stood with the activists when they told him, don't come to Atlanta and just go to Dr. King's grave and go to Morehouse and stand around Black people. If you're gonna have a press conference, make it diverse. Talk about how these voter suppression laws are gonna hurt Black folk, white people, Latinos, disabled. In other words, make it an American issue. That's what they did in Selma. They said the voting rights in '65 was an American issue. And that racism was anti-American, not just anti-Black. It was anti-humanity. And so I think that we have to not just say, pick up phrases, this is Jim Crow point two. This is something even worse than Jim Crow point two, if there's a worse, in the sense that there's an attempt not just to block, but there's an attempt to rob the entire democracy and the progressive vote for the next 30 to 40 years.
We have a very active coordinated committee here. Faye Kennedy is one of those. She's one of my favorite people, actually. And she's doing a lot of stuff with the unhoused. And how do you keep those that have joined you in the cause? How do you keep them mobilized and motivated for this work?
Well, they keep me mobilized.
Okay.
See, this movement is led by poor and low wealth people, along with religious leaders and that. It's not for the poor, it's with the poor and low wealth. And we built it from the bottom up. They said what the name should be. They said we have to put a face on these issues. They've said we have no choice but to fight. This is about life and death for people.
Yeah.
And this is not tiddlywinks. And as I said, there are 43% of this nation of the people that are suffering in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. And even during this pandemic, what the pandemic has been done is it has exposed the fissures of poverty and racism in ways that we were off to see it now, because even when it comes to the death in COVID, the majority, the highest percentages of the death was among the very people we called them service workers before COVID, essential workers after COVID, and made them go to work without health care, without protections, and they became the first to get sick and the first to die.
Yeah, they couldn't afford not to go to work.
Exactly. And the very thing we're releasing a report next week
I was going to
at
ask
the
you
Press
about
Club that shows that the government hasn't even tracked how pandemics really hurt the poor, because if they'd had, it would show how even the way in which we dispersed services and protections was unequal. So the COVID isn't discriminatory, but our response to it has been, and it has been discriminatory based on class and on race and on disability. So the people are making this movement. And I'll give you this last year in 2020, we had planned to have a mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington.
Yes.
And to the polls in 2020, and COVID hit. And so we had to cancel. But when we got ready to cancel, the people said no. And we said, but we can't go. They said, well, we can go online. But we have to do this until we can go in person. 2.7 million people showed up just on our Zoom and social media. Millions of others. There's a hunger out in the country to say, these things that we are seeing do not have to exist. They can be dealt with. We can end poverty and low wealth. Now, I'm not naive to suggest it's easy, but I'm also not so despairing that I don't know that I believe it's not possible. Yes. We have to challenge the lie of scarcity. We don't have a scarcity of resources, and neither do we have a scarcity of ideas and policies that could address it. What we have is a scarcity of moral consciousness, and you can only build that by having mass movements and campaigns that are not just one-day events, but declarations that people say, we're not going to be silent or quiet anymore, and we're going to mobilize in the streets, in the political streets, and at the ballot box. And our deadline is not when the politician says we're going to take a vote on the bill, and if it doesn't pass, that's it. Our deadline is victory. Our deadline is fighting until we see the change that we know must occur.